So hi, my name is Susan McGregor. I am indeed an associate research scholar at the Data Science Institute at Columbia University, and co-chair of the Center for Data, Media, and Society there. And today I want to take the opportunity to talk with you all about not really a little bit research that I've been doing, but more about research that I will hope to do in the future. And in some ways that I hope some of you will also be interested in. So for me, this talk really comes out of reflecting on the last 10 years of research that I've been doing in computer security. As Carmela mentioned, largely focusing on the needs of journalists and news organizations. So I've done a number of academic research studies, and this past June actually published a book, which you can see the cover shot of here, called Information Security Essentials, a guide for reporters, editors, and news organizations. And what's interesting to me as I think back on this is the process in particular of writing the book, and the fact that writing a book like this was even possible. When I pitched this book was 4 years ago. And I remember speaking to the person at the press. It was published through Columbia University Press. And, you know, university press publishing is kind of a slow process. And when I submitted the proposal, I got a couple pieces of feedback. One was journalists don't buy books about journalism, that, you know, technology changes so quickly, security changes so quickly, you know, how can you be sure that the material in this book is still going to be relevant, you know, in the year or several years from now when it actually publishes? And the answer that I gave at that time, which I still think is correct, is that yes, a lot changes. And I think especially from outside this space, it seems like it changes all the time. But I also argued, I think, in a way that many people here would agree with, that it really hasn't changed that much. I mean, the way that the internet functions, right? How data moves around the internet is still pretty much the same as it's been for decades, right? And we all know that that has security and privacy implications, and most people don't know how that works. You know, things like multi-factor authentication. Okay, the form has changed. 10, 15 years ago when I worked in a corporation, I had an RSA key fob for my second factor. You know, today maybe I have an app like Google Authenticator or Duo or something, right? But really the advice that we're giving people about security hasn't changed that much in many instances, particularly when it comes to end users. So in some ways this was good for the book, but the thing is that while the advice and many of the circumstances have changed the same, a lot about computer security has not stayed the same. And so this is my very precisely calculated graph of trends in security behaviors versus attack vectors, right? So I think this is a trend that all of us can recognize. It's reflected in a lot of the research in this conference and many other security conferences, which is the fact that at the same time that I think we're gaining a lot of really important ground in improving security behaviors, improving security tools so that you know, end users can really benefit from them and protect their data and protect their systems, the number of attack vectors has just exploded, right? Obviously, IoT has a lot to do with this. It's extremely difficult as a regular consumer today to buy almost anything that isn't connected to the internet, right? Just go and try to buy, you know, dating myself here, try to buy a television set, right? That doesn't have an internet connection, a home thermostat, a door camera, an oven, a refrigerator, I mean, a car, right? All of these systems are connected to the internet. All of them are collecting data and transmitting data. All of them constitute attack vectors, right? So even though we're gaining ground, there is, I think, this really important gap that in many ways is just expanding, right? No matter how many more people we reach and how much we improve these tools, there is always going to be security failures, right? I think all of us would agree that that is true. I think many of us would argue that perfect security isn't even the end goal, right? That there's always going to be some gap. And my pitch to you all today is that I think security research should be looking at what happens in that gap. What is the experience and what are some of the solutions that maybe we can design and we can offer and really start to think through that look at the needs of people who have been affected by security failures or security breaches. So to illustrate this, I want to give kind of two example domains. The first one I want to talk about is identity fraud or identity theft. This is the US edition. I know there's a lot of material in this where, this is a European conference. I know there's a lot of material in this that many folks in Europe are going to go, well, that's a very typically American problem. And it's true. There are a lot of parts of the system that stem from really typically American problems, but they're still real problems. And I would argue they're not solely relevant to the US. But this is an article from earlier this year. It says that consumers in America lost roughly $56 billion to identity fraud. Some percentage of that is kind of traditional identity theft, which is where someone actually uses your PII to, open a bank account or a credit card or something like that. A lot of it is direct from consumers. So it's more in the kind of ransomware, social engineering to grant access to a system kind of thing. It's a lot of money. For reference, this is the large majority of the US Department of Education's annual budget, which was $64 billion last year. Again, very typically American issue there, but I also chose this particular headline, not just because it has this big number in it, but because I think it's really a good example of kind of the best advice that we're able to offer people in this instance. So if you were to read the rest of this article, it contains some, very familiar advice: how to recognize phishing emails, how to not download malware, how to strengthen your passwords, right? All the same things that we have been saying for a long, long time. And despite that, these things go on. So by count, they estimate that 49 million Americans were affected by identity fraud or theft last year. That's 15% of the population. That's a lot of people. Whoops. So what's the solution? Well, right now, if you are the victim of identity fraud or identity theft, there's this lovely website run by the Federal Trade Commission called identitytheft.gov. And here's a smattering of the options for what you can do if you are affected by this. So, or things that might bring you to this website. So federal tax return or claimed an economic stimulus payment using your information. Someone tried to use your information and you're worried about identity theft, or your information was exposed in a data breach. Now, if you were to follow through this website, you would basically get the opportunity to hand over a lot more information about yourself and send it off into the ether. And then who knows what happens? Maybe you get contacted by law enforcement. As someone who actually has been through an identity theft, in an offline style identity theft, I can tell you the answer is not a lot happens. Law enforcement, not really well positioned to deal with this. And I can tell you that I spent dozens of hours and years sort of trying to recover my financial profile. And because of what? I had done really nothing wrong. I had followed all of the steps available to me in terms of protecting my information, and it's still so no help. I think it might actually have happened before this website even existed. And I would argue that that's a space where this community can start thinking about making a difference for the regular people who are affected by this every single day. Another space that I want to mention here that's relevant is online harassment, which is anywhere on earth, right? Again, identity fraud and theft, as I've put it forward here, is maybe mostly the purview of everywhere. This is just a smattering of headlines and research. This top line number, the 73% of women respondents, that comes from a UNESCO survey that was completed in December of 2020. 63% have been threatened or harassed online. 58%, so 5% less, have been threatened this year. Okay, so massive problem. Again, hard to stress the severity of the impact that this is having on people's lives. I think it's really one of those things that is very, very difficult. I think these are both things that are very difficult to get our heads around unless a massive, massive impact. And, you know, some of the research that I've been doing, this grew directly out of my work in journalism security. Quaint idea that, you know, I would cover fundamentals of how the internet worked, and then, you know, what individuals should do, and then what organizations should do, and like that would be the structure of the book. And then I'd have a couple chapters at the end that was like looking forward, you know, what are the problems coming down the line. And I am not sure, I guess I'm still online here. Sorry.
All good, all good.
What would be, okay, sorry, something changed. And the reality is that those things haven't, by the time I actually got to talking to people in the newsroom, they were like, this is our number one problem. Online harassment is absolutely our number one problem. And this was not, they weren't even talking mostly about women journalists. They were, you know, these were large multinational kind of hard news organizations that covered business and finance. It was still absolutely their number one problem. So what do we do? I think in thinking about this, what I want to ask first is take a step back and say, why does computer security matter? Why do we study computer security? Why is this something that we research? And let's be honest, a computer doesn't care if it's being used for malware. It is not sentient. It doesn't have feelings about it. We care about computer systems because of the implications that they have for people. And that's actually why we research computer security, right? This is why we care about computer security, is because of the consequences that those security measures and the failure of those security measures have for people. And I'm not saying that we're wrong to focus on prevention, but again, given what we know about the gap between prevention and attacks, that we know that there will be these failures, I don't think it's the only thing that we should think about. Let me rephrase that. I think we should think more about what happens for people who suffer security failures. I also want to draw a distinction here because I think many of us in this space would say, well, yeah, we do care about what happens with these failures. We try to prevent them. And I think there is a lot of really interesting work on recovery. But a lot of times we take the default of prioritizing the concerns of the system owners, right? So even though the impact of those security failures is typically and disproportionately felt by the system users. So a perfect example in the identity fraud and theft space is something like the Equifax data breach that happened a number of years ago. What was the actual impact of that for the company? Well, let's see, they set up a super insecure website where people could report that they had been affected by it because they didn't have the resources to do it in their own domain. It's very telling. You know, the CEO or whoever came out and basically said there's one person who was supposed to apply this patch that had been available for at least several months who didn't do it. And that's why all of this happened. And I think for any of us in this space who were looking at that, you know, you're going, you just didn't have adequate security. We know that you didn't have adequate security. And that was really the problem. And there was sort of this very extremely nominal payment that went to people who were affected. But I can tell you that obviously it didn't make up for the, at best, many hours that victims would have spent trying to recover from that, if they were even able to. And in many cases, I would almost guarantee you they were not. So, you know, from the system owner's perspective in that case, it wasn't really that big a deal. But from the system users, right, and we could split hairs about whether or not, for example, people who are part of credit reporting agencies are really users of that system, but they are definitely impacted by it. I want to point out here that I do not want to undermine or underestimate the importance of usable security. Usable security is super important. And I think it's really heartening and significant how much this, computer security has really become attuned to the importance of usability, especially in the last couple of decades. We, I think, all recognize at this point that a security system that is not usable is not secure because people can't use it. And that's good. But I think we also need to develop systems that respond to those human consequences of security failures. So just again, to kind of frame what I'm talking about here, in that article about the $56 billion lost to identity theft and fraud last year, they estimate that the average loss for an individual was $1,100. Okay, a $500 expense would put most Americans into debt. Okay, into debt means what? It means you get behind on rent. It means you get behind on a car payment. You can't buy gas to get to work. You can't buy the food you need. You can't buy the medications you need, right? That's an extremely real and serious impact on your life. Again, Equifax as a company didn't really have to change much. You know, their recovery plan was kind of lip service to the incident and what frankly amounts to a very little bit of money. But for the individuals who were affected, this was potentially devastating. And that's true of really all identity fraud and identity theft. Same thing with online harassment. 1 in 5 of the respondents in that UNESCO survey that came out at the end of 2020 said that they've been attacked offline in connection with online violence. A third of them roughly are going to self-censor on social media. 10% of them are going to avoid certain stories. A number will just leave the profession altogether. And one of the reasons why I focus on, well, obviously one of the reasons why I focus on the experiences of journalists is because it's a space that I come from and care a lot about. And it's also because it is, because these are people for whom this kind of participation, being online, being on social media, is non-optional, right? So even if we were to accept the, I think, very dubious idea that, well, if you have a problem with it, just don't do it, that isn't an option here. And these people are being harmed in very, very real ways, even if you just take these stats, right? The response in most cases is anemic at best. There's a lot of grow a thicker skin, et cetera, et cetera. Unfortunately, I would argue that if you were to put the word sexual in there instead of online, you would find that a lot of the responses to online harassment today look like responses to sexual harassment half a century ago, right? It's not that big a deal. You just need to get over it. And I really hope that that is not how we are going to treat online harassment going forward, right? As just a rerun of 50 years of trying to have something like sexual harassment taken seriously and having real tools to deal with it. Okay, so what do we do? As I said, this talk, I wanted to put this forward as kind of an idea of the type of research that I would like to be doing. And in that, because security failures are a given, I think that we should research how best to recover from and respond to them according to the needs of the people who are most affected. So by that, I mean the end users. I mean the people on the end of identity theft. I mean the people who are affected by online harassment. I think that those are the people whose needs we need to consider and figure out what can make this better. Yes, this is going to be very interdisciplinary, but I would argue that there are plenty of technical systems that could be employed to improve this situation. And as an example, I think that a lot of times my outsider's impression of the trajectory of security research, at least in the United States, is that it has been very driven by close cooperation and leadership with the government and military. Computer systems and computer security and internet work came out of those relationships. But I think that we are at a moment where it's important for us as security researchers to kind of take the lead and say, this is an important part of this domain, and this is something that we should be dedicating research to. And the example for this that I want to offer that may be familiar to many of you is kind of the transition of AI and ML research over the last, 8 or 10 years. In 2014, Fairness and Transparency in Machine Learning launched as a workshop run by a handful of researchers. Within a few years, in part because of its success and because of the related workshops that cropped up in related research areas, it became an ACM conference. And today it's still an ACM conference, but importantly, it is a central topic of research across the board. And I would argue that this is something that we should be thinking about when we look at the consequences of security failures. So what I want to say is, let's make recovery from security failures a part of what we do in computer security research and focus within that on the needs of the people who are the reason why those computer systems matter in the first place. Okay, that is it. That's my whole pitch. I am very interested to hear feedback. I also just want to say I'm obviously not the only person talking about this kind of thing. I would say that there's a big thread of this that I share. If you haven't watched Sunny Kamara's talk from last year called Crypto for the People, it's an excellent talk. And I think, well, I'd like to think that very much in the same vein of thinking about how we can use our research work to really benefit people. Because in my experience of this community, that's why so many of us are here, is because we genuinely care about protecting the people that make the systems important. And I think that by focusing on what happens after the attack, when there is a security failure, and what that means to those affected, we can really fulfill that vision even more.